Good evening. My name is Matt Lehrman. I am the Energy Strategy Coordinator for the City of Boulder, and I'm here tonight to talk about the city's current status in its effort to create a municipal electric utility, but more broadly to achieve what the City Council calls its energy future goals. So what I will talk about tonight, like I said, I'll talk about Boulder's energy future and how we arrived at this point. I'll talk a little bit about what is and is not happening today. I'll talk about where we are in the municipalization process, and I'll talk a little bit about the financial forecast tool that kind of underpins a lot of this. And I think ideally I'm going to answer all of your questions during the presentation, but if I don't, I think it's probably easier if we hold them all to the end so we can kind of move through the entire story, and then I can answer questions and I'll be around later in the evening as well. So very broadly, we can take a step back from municipalization and think about Boulder and what we're trying to achieve in terms of our energy future goals. And when we say energy, it's important to remember that we're thinking about it very broadly. It's not just electricity, but it's also thermal energy for heating. It is also fossil fuels related to transportation use. And so when we say energy, it's very broadly considered for all of those areas. And then we drop electricity into one of those buckets. So in December of 2016, the City Council adopted some fairly aggressive goals for the community related to energy. And at a high level, we seek an 80% reduction in total sector emissions, again, thermal, electricity, and transportation by 2050. More narrowly for the city organization, so that's City of Boulder operations, we seek that same 80% reduction by 2030. And this is based on a 2005 baseline. So that's where we measured from, and that's how we're benchmarking it. And then more narrowly for electricity, we are looking for 100% renewable electricity by 2030. We are in the process of defining those sources and considering options for how that works. One goal that we have arrived upon that the City Council has approved is 100 megawatts of local generation by 2030 in support of that goal. We think largely that's going to come from solar, but there are certainly other opportunities. The city does have some hydro resource in the city that could potentially provide some supply, and there's maybe some other options as well. But we do think primarily that will come from solar in terms of achieving that 100 megawatt goal. And just for kind of a baseline today in the city limits, when you consider the rooftop installations as well as installations here on campus at CU, at the school district, subscriptions that customers have to community solar gardens, we're in around the 20 megawatt range just for solar. So that's before you take into account any other generation on campus here, before the hydro assets, just about 20 megawatts of solar. So over 13 or 14 years, that's kind of like the margin that we're looking to make up. I don't know everyone in the room, and so I'm going to give a little bit of a background on how the city arrived at its decision to seek a municipal utility. So bear with me if you've heard this 100 times before or more. But starting really about 10 or 12 years ago, the city began seriously thinking about how it wanted to play a role in addressing the challenges associated with climate change. And the research and analysis then and even today reveals that our fuel supply on par is one of the most carbon intensive in the nation, as Leslie said. And XCEL has really made some great strides over the last many years, but at the same time, it still remains very coal and also natural gas reliant. And so the city said, all right, that's a good starting point. How can we reduce some of our carbon emissions related with electricity? The city has made several statements over the years, starting from the implementation of the first climate tax in 2006, all the way to various energy efficiency standards for city operations, for rental units, for new build construction, and has spoken pretty loudly that we want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And so we're going to aggressively pursue multiple different ways to do that. So as I said, there's been a lot of efficiency programs that the city has offered both in partnership with XCEL and separately, including incentives that are funded in part by the carbon tax that I mentioned. But at the end of the day, we realized that really to make the really rapid acceleration towards reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, that we said we need to control the fuel supply. We need to be able to procure our own sources of power. And in the intervening years, not only did that make climate sense, but it also really makes economic sense today. And so a huge benefit of creating a municipal utility would be the ability to go out and really at a large scale procure our own power supply. There's been multiple attempts to work with XCEL over the years. Some of them have borne some fruit, some have not, but ultimately we're at a place today where in parallel with the municipalization, we should have come up with an easier word than municipalization. I don't even think it's a word, and it's what we use, and you have to say it publicly. But ultimately we're at a place where there's kind of a parallel path going right now where we are pursuing the municipal utility and at the same time discussing settlement negotiations with XCEL. So they're happening simultaneously, but at this point, they're both going forward. But ultimately, what we have revealed and what I'll talk about tonight, or what we have learned, is that the municipal utility is a viable path for the city to achieve its climate goals, or its energy future goals very broadly. Some key milestones, like I said, the city really in about 2005, there was a group of citizens that got together and started to evaluate the various options to meet our energy future goals. In 2010, the franchise agreement, which is a typical long-term agreement that communities sign with utilities that governs things like right-of-way use. I won't bore you with the details. That expired in 2010, which created an opportunity for the community to say, yes, this is something we are interested in evaluating. In 2010, part of what goes with the franchise agreement is a fee on your utility bill that functions more as a tax to pay for the use of the right-of-way and other things, but is a source of revenue for the city. When the franchise expires, that fee goes away. So the Boulder voters said, that funds things like schools and funds various city services. We'd like to replace it. So in 2010, voters approved a measure that would replace the franchise fee with what you see on your bill today as a utility occupation tax. It raises the same amount of money as the franchise fee. So the city ultimately is revenue neutral in that regard, but raises that money to pay for those same fees. Since then, there's been ongoing negotiations of various forms with XCEL, including at least one community working group. At the same time, the voters in 2011 then passed various charter metrics related to the creation of an electric utility, including funding some of the analysis to examine the feasibility. Over the next 2 years after that, that analysis really unfolded. There were multiple working groups. There was a lot of modeling of different scenarios of power supply, of various operational costs, did a lot of data collection, and ultimately a third party reviewed the work and said, yes, based on what we see today, we think that the muni is a viable path forward. The city council said, yes, we agree. So the development of the transition plan began in terms of operating utility, in terms of formulating the Public Utility Commission application that would separate the systems, and various other proceedings began at that point. In 2015, the utility operational plan continued to unfold. We filed our initial application with the Public Utilities Commission. And at that point, part of the plan included acquiring some assets that were outside of the city limits. The Public Utilities Commission said, we can't overstep your right to form a municipal utility, but you can't acquire any assets in the county or outside the city limits or that serve non-city customers. So some additional analysis was done to determine alternative ways to separate the system that enable us to only acquire assets within the system, within the city, and that only serve city customers. In September of 2016, that supplemental application was filed, which began the PUC process that is underway today, and that I'll talk about in a few minutes. I was gonna ask for questions, but I said let's hold questions, so let's hold questions. And then finally, and I'll also talk about this, is in November of last year, the city published a detailed financial forecast laid out what our best thinking is today in terms of assumptions about operating costs and construction costs, acquisition costs, power supply, our forecast on rates. The city charter has some very specific metrics about rates, and so we did an extensive rate modeling exercise, and all came together in a financial forecast tool that you can download. It's an Excel spreadsheet on our website. There's variables that you can play with, and ultimately it allows us today to evaluate multiple different scenarios of a municipal utility, and then in the event that a utility is actually formed, we'd be able to actually use it really as an operating accounting tool to be able to compare historical results to forecast results and really support operational and managerial decision making. But I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. So again, kind of thinking maybe big picture about our energy future goals, there's a lot of things we can do today, regardless of if we have a franchise, regardless of whether or not the city is a customer of XCEL. The city has done a lot of targeted solar outreach. We have a solar tool on our website that is used by residences and businesses and solar installers to evaluate solar potential and the economics of various different types of installations across the city. We have received funding to do some nanogrid pilots, one with VIA, one at our wastewater treatment facility that looks at not only reducing emissions through on-site solar generation, but also at potentially improving the resilience of the facilities with use of storage and load management. The city offers solar grants every year to various nonprofits. We have taken a variety of steps related to electric vehicles, including in the city fleet. We have offered 2 group purchase programs over the last 18 months with Nissan and BMW and with electric bike manufacturers. And we probably put, the last number was maybe 225, 250 vehicles on the road within the city of Boulder across those various, primarily Nissan and BMW. We've installed charging stations, both for our fleet operations again, but also in public locations. We are in the process of adding about a dozen more charging stations downtown Boulder, and there will be additional charging stations at CU, at the school district. So we're starting to do a fair amount with electric vehicles. The city council just approved an energy offset fund, which still being, mostly I don't know the full details of it because it was really just discussed about 2 weeks ago. Again, a good question for Jonathan. But there's a lot we can do today, regardless of whether or not we have a municipal utility. There's also a lot of things we can't do today. As I discussed, there's things like at a large scale, we can do a lot of local generation, but at a large scale, we can't make rapid purchases of a lot of renewable electricity. And so that's one thing we have a difficulty doing, is controlling the ultimate carbon intensity of our portfolio. It's difficult to kind of plan for strategic investments in the grid infrastructure in the community, both for things like resilience, but related to things like battery storage or undergrounding, but even kind of aligning different activities that we're doing. If there's a new project, or if there's going to be a road dug up and there's going to be an opportunity to underground some of the distribution system, we don't necessarily have the ability to align that right now, and so we can't do that today as well. It's difficult, as I said on the last slide, there are some things we can do to kind of push new technology forward, but it is difficult to kind of provide kind of a pilot testing ground for a lot of new technologies. There's 30, 40, 50 businesses in Boulder at least that are trying out various new business models, various new products and technologies that are really difficult to offer them kind of a platform to operate within the city. And then, as I said, with things like battery storage and undergrounding and load management, it's really difficult to kind of to impact the resilience of our system. We're limited by the amount of generation we can put on site. We're limited in certain ways what we can do with that generation. And so a municipal utility might create some of those levers to allow us to do that. So at a high level, really what needs to change is the ability to run towards the future of customer-sited renewables, of distributed resources like battery storage, integration of electric vehicle charging into day-to-day system operations. But at the end of the day, we really are looking for multiple different forms of renewable electricity as quickly as possible. And to give you kind of I guess maybe a step back sense of where we're at, when you think about, is a municipal utility a good idea? Is it better to stay with an investor-owned utility? This is a snapshot of a reliability metric called SAIDI from 2015. It's the average duration of an outage for across customers served. And the bars you can see in red, without looking at even at the numbers, the bars you see in red are the 9 different departments that XCEL divides its service territory into across the state. And I believe the third bar, I don't know how this, right here is the Boulder department, which includes the city, but then areas within the county as well. The 2 navy blue bars you see here are 2 municipal utilities in the state, Colorado Springs and Fort Collins. And so just in terms of like scores, obviously this is just a snapshot in time, but you can see that the ability to control your local system and make targeted investments really does bear fruit for utilities like that in terms of improving reliability for customers. You can see the same thing when you compare rates. Now, rates are a really difficult thing to compare in general. This is a report that the Colorado Association of Municipal Utilities puts out every year. This is from January of this year, where they're comparing average rates across different utilities. The blue bar is municipal utilities in the state, the red bar is cooperative, customer-owned utilities in the state, and the green bar is investor-owned utilities, which would be XCEL and also Black Hills. So this is really a composite. These utilities are all different sizes, but at least at a snapshot level, when you consider kind of the average rates across residential, small and large commercial and industrial, municipal utilities really do offer pretty a competitive package in terms of rates. It's a nice slide. So ultimately, when we put all those things together, what we are thinking about is moving towards the utility of the future. And when you think about a utility today that is making large capital investments and then looking to recover those investments over time through the sales of kilowatt hours, it works really well. It's built a really phenomenal system that's probably not matched anywhere in the world. But at the same time, in terms of customer demands related to new technology, related to climate change, we think there's an opportunity to improve on that model that is more focused on services for customers, whether it's reduced emissions or low cost or reliability improvements or new technology or whatever it is, but really focusing on earning a return based on services rather than just straight kilowatt hour sales. And related to that is equitable access to distributed generation. There's certainly a model for DG that works today, primarily solar, but opening up a platform and really, again, when you're not relying on those kilowatt hour sales, but thinking about services, it opens up some new business models, I think, for distributed generation. The same for demand side management. Boulder has been very aggressive in adopting demand side management, but at least from an XCEL perspective today, we're subject to the programs that are designed for the whole state. Those programs should absolutely exist, but we think there's some opportunities to maybe tailor that a little more closely to the needs of Boulder. And then again, I can't reiterate this enough, just the ability to integrate as much renewable electricity as quickly as possible within the context of a sustainable business model. Oops. So at the end of the day, change can be scary. I think the average electricity customer thinks about their bill for maybe 5 to 10 minutes per year. Most people not even that much because it's auto pay because nobody thinks about it. But so change can be scary, but at the same time, change has happened before. Suddenly you get better technology. It offers you more flexibility. It offers you better choice. And we think we're on the verge of something like this with electricity, which maybe a lot of people didn't think about. So, as I said, one potential path for Boulder achieving its energy future goals is the creation of a municipal utility. And where we're at today, as I mentioned, is we have filed an application with the Public Utilities Commission to actually define how the systems will be separated and determine what equipment we're going to acquire and how we are going to design the system. And as I thought about that, I realized that surprisingly, most people don't know how the Public Utilities Commission works. So it's easy to read a lot about it in the paper, and which is not necessarily wrong, but I think it's helpful to understand in terms of if you want to be influential in this industry, to know how the rules are actually made, how the keys to the castle are actually forged. So as I said, we filed our application last September. And the way that works is there's a party that is seeking a new program, a new product, a new service, a new power plant. They have to apply to XCEL in the investor-owned utility model. They would apply to the PUC. There are interested parties who may be affected by this proposal, whether it's ratepayers, small residential, or a large industrial, or industries like solar installers. They are permitted to request to participate. It's called being an intervener in the process. That happened as of the end of the last year. Once the application has then been accepted by the Public Utilities Commission, which happened earlier this year, the intervening parties can serve what's called discovery to ask questions about various assertions and claims that are made in the application. So that happened because Boulder was the applicant in this case. The various parties are seeking information from Boulder. Then in response to the answers that we provide and based on the various parties' opinions about the application, they file answer testimony in the case, and they respond and say, yes, we like this idea, no, we don't like that idea. And then Boulder and other parties are then able to then repeat the discovery process and say, hey, why did you say this? Why did you say that? We like this, we don't like that. And ultimately arrives to a place where modifications to the original application can be made. It's called rebuttal testimony, typically filed by the applicant. Then there can be additional discovery again, and then potentially cross-answer testimony to modify the original answer testimony, where everyone's really refining their positions and saying, here's what we really think about the proposal, whether we think it should be accepted, it should be modified, it should be rejected. There is a PUC hearing, and ultimately the parties file their final statements after the hearing when the witnesses are actually questioned, and then the PUC makes a decision. So if you're following closely in the paper or potentially on Twitter, we are right here where rebuttal testimony was filed in the middle of last month. And so the positions are now being refined by both sides, and we are approaching ultimately a time when the city will file its rebuttal testimony. Sorry, that I can't tell where that arrow is actually pointing. So we're at the point right here, actually. We'll file the rebuttal testimony will be due at the end of the month, and the hearing today is scheduled to start at the end of April. So that's a really condensed version of how the PUC works, or is designed to work, and that's where we are today. So what's in Boulder's application? It's a quick 1,000-page read or so, and it contains all of how we think the system should be separated. But at its core, there's three main components. One, there's the actual separation plan and how we think the system should be physically separated so that the city of Boulder municipal utility would have one system, and then XCEL would operate its own system outside the city, and then for the remainder of its customers across Colorado. There's what we've called the transition period agreement, which would define how the systems would be transitioned. It's not so simple as just one day it's XCEL, the next day it's the city of Boulder. There's construction that's required, and there's various operational characteristics that we've been talking about. And so that is being discussed at the PUC today. And then finally, there's what's called the gradual departure plan. And that, more than anything, is seeking to define how we will transition our power supply. And we have a proposal today that seeks to enable us to increase our renewables at a pace that kind of mirrors when XCEL has a need to build new generation. I think I could talk a lot longer on this, but maybe for now this is a good description. But these are the three main components of the plan, of the application. So like I said, this is where we are. We filed last September. The interventions were granted. The answer testimony was filed, and now last Friday there was a pre-hearing conference to lay out some of the final legal issues, because as multiple parties, including Boulder, have noted, this has never really fully happened like this in Colorado. So there were some outstanding legal questions that the PUC said, we don't know how to really think about this, and so we'd like some guidance from all the parties, and the parties weighed in on that on Friday in an attempt to help kind of shape how the hearing will ultimately take place next month. And like I said, you may have been following in the news, there's been various different decision points and key actions that have happened. Two of the commissioners, one resigned at the end of last year and one finished his term at the end of last year. So there's, since this process started in 2011, there's 3 new commissioners now on the commission. The pre-hearing conference has been covered. The PUC asked really about 4 hours worth of questions on last Friday of all parties to weigh in on these legal topics. And so really the camera is a great source of news at this point to kind of, if you want to at a high level stay apprised of what's happening. You can also dive into the Utility Commission filings and read the positions of all of the parties as well. But this is a good way to kind of stay up to date. So for the remainder of the year, this is the estimated timeline that we have. Again, the rebuttal testimony at the end of this month, the hearing at the end of April and into early May, and then the PUC has indicated that they will file a decision by the middle of June. At the same time, while this is ongoing, there's a group of us that are working more specifically on the implementation of that separation plan, of the transition plan, and of the gradual departure plan. And then depending on the outcome of the PUC hearing on June 15th, we would move to condemnation court, which would be an exercise in actually condemning the assets and placing a value on what the city would acquire from XCEL, and that would probably run through the remainder of the year. So this is a very high level snapshot of what we can expect, I think, for the remainder of 2017. Okay, I can answer questions on that again at the end, but that's a very high level. This is where we are at today in terms of the municipalization process component of Energy Future. We also get a lot of questions about the financial forecast tool that we published last fall. So I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about that. And again, probably at a high level, and I can answer questions either after or offline, but I'll talk about a little bit about what it is, what it's not, some of the assumptions, and some of the results as they exist today. So the city created a financial forecast tool because more than anything, one of the city charter metrics is that this needs to be financially viable, that we have to be able to make our debt payments, that we have to be able to offer rates on day one that are comparable to XCEL, that we can match XCEL's reliability, that we can increase renewables, that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we really needed to put some numbers behind that. And at the end of the day, the other part of it is there's an acquisition limit that we can spend on acquiring the distribution system. So we needed to make sure in all of this planning that we could really afford to do this, because if we can't meet the charter metrics, we can't move forward with the municipal utility. It's not a blank check to move forward and do this at all costs possible. We need to do this in not only an environmentally sensitive way, but an economically sensitive way. So as I said before, this is very useful for us right now in the transition period, but it's also created as a tool that we can use long term, both to inform our decision making, but also to compare against historical results. So it's not so much a static tool, this is the end result, this is what we think, this is very much, we're constantly updating assumptions as new publicly available information becomes available, as our analysis says, no, you don't need to construct that, yes, you do need to construct that, costs change, but it's a very dynamic tool in that regard. And at the same time, we wanted to make it user-friendly and accessible, not only for city staff, but to be transparent to the community and say, this is how we've modeled this. Give us all of your feedback, good, bad, ugly, and help us refine our assumptions. Because again, if we can't meet the charter metrics, we're not going to move forward. So we may as well take the wisdom of the entire community and say, what can we do differently? What do you like? What do you not like? And again, you can download this on our website today. It's free. We built it to forecast out for 20 years. Obviously, forecasting into the future is, you may get lucky with your one model run, but your other 1 million are probably wrong. So we set a 20-year horizon for the planning period, but it can easily be extended in the tool. And as I mentioned, it's kind of designed to evaluate the key metrics that are laid out in the charter. And to do that, we look at the cash flows, we look at various budgets for different parts of the utility, we look at the revenue requirement, what we need to recover to, at the very least, break even, and to make sure that we can service our debt that we would have to take out for any system upgrades. And finally, really we can use this to determine how we want to operate, whether we need to find cheaper power, whether we need more energy efficiency, whether we need to reduce expenses somewhere else, whether we need to raise rates, anything like that can be considered in the tool. What it does not do, it does not actually design the rates. The rates are a key component, obviously, in terms of the revenue that we anticipate generating. So what we did is we took the XCEL rates as we did today, and we took all of the various assumptions that we think will inform those rates going forward, primarily using XCEL data available in the electric resource plan, but looking at what the forecasted coal prices are, forecasted natural gas prices, estimates in load growth, estimates for a number of different factors that ultimately go into rates. And we forecasted that out for the major customer classes in Boulder for 20 years. And that includes all of the riders that are on the bill today, for demand side management, for fuel, for capacity, for renewable energy, and so forth. Probably better to talk about that a little more offline, but ultimately, the tool itself doesn't design rates. That will ultimately be a separate activity. So what we've done is, as I said, forecasted XCEL's rates going forward. The tool doesn't generate load forecasts. What we've used right now is customer class averages for each of the classes, and we've escalated that at XCEL's forecasted load growth, but obviously that could be very different in Boulder, and as an operating utility, we'll have a lot more data to be able to refine that. So we started from a place where we're not actually going to generate some load forecasts in here. We need additional data. We don't do power supply modeling, so in terms of what the actual load curve is in Boulder and aligning our generation with Boulder's load curve, we just simply don't have that data at this point. And so we're not doing power supply modeling here. We're not measuring actual reliability metrics, and we're not comparing rates with peer utilities. That's kind of a sub-provision within the charter that not only do our rates have to be comparable with XCEL, but also with other comparable and neighboring utilities. That will all be done. This is not what the purpose of the financial tool is. So ultimately, and this is easier to see if you download the tool, what we've done is tested a variety of assumptions in the tool, primarily related to the acquisition costs, to the interest rates that we'd have to charge on our debt, to the actual debt service coverage ratio. The city charter says we need to collect enough revenue to not only pay our debt, but also have a 25% reserve in reserve to cover any potential shortfalls that might emerge. And so we tested various reserve levels from 25% up to 75%. We tested various assumptions about what we think our O&M are going to be. We benchmarked that against the American Public Power Institute, or Public Power Association. So there's some ranges there that you can test about operations and maintenance. And we also vary load growth, which has an impact on how much revenue you ultimately collect. So when you download the tool, these are the variables you can change. There's obviously many other variables, but for public purposes right now, these have the biggest impact. You can also toggle the power supply. We have several different power supply scenarios, and so you can toggle that as well, and that has an impact, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So the preliminary results using our base case, which is highlighted in here, where we're assuming a $150 million acquisition costs. You can see our interest rates. You can see the debt service coverage ratio, the median for O&M costs, and the median for estimated load growth. And based on those inputs, ultimately three of the four scenarios that are published result in long-term cost savings relative to XCEL. That's assuming, again, that these are the assumptions and that we hit those assumptions. But the savings are really primarily driven by that rapid transition to renewable electricity that we think is available more cheaply on the market today. There's a fourth scenario that did not provide long-term cost savings, and that was a scenario in which instead of transitioning to renewables, we purchased power from XCEL for 20 years as a wholesale customer, which is something that many municipal utilities do in the state. But in terms of what we forecast their power supply costs to be relative to what we think we can achieve on the market with renewables, that scenario did not produce long-term cost savings, which again is a key metric within the charter, the city charter. Those three of those four scenarios again met all of the charter metrics, and that actually there they are laid out for you. But we were able to meet all 6 of the charter metrics using those assumptions at that base case. And so ultimately that created a scenario where we thought where over the long term there were a significant amount of savings that were available, and those are available for a lot of different things. We could increase the amount of renewables, we could lower rates, we could improve the system with things like undergrounding or battery storage or microgrids, but ultimately those savings are up to the community to decide. The city council becomes the PUC effectively, there's a utility governing board, and ultimately when savings exist like that, it's a community discussion about how best to invest. And it may simply be we want to lower rates, but it could also be we want to pay for battery storage for everyone. It could be, there's a wide range. But ultimately, I think the key message is that money stays in the community, and the community decides how to invest. It was a lot of talking, and I think really the takeaway is we're very convinced that the utility market is changing. We think the change is necessary and it's inevitable because of the threat of climate change, because of the ability to save money for people, and because of the ability to improve resilience. There is that all of those factors are changing customer demand. We think the technology is available today and will become even more available to meet those needs. And again, if we can do that and address the climate impact, that's, it's a win-win-win across the board. And what we really think about is ultimately it's a centralized business model that exists today, transitioning to a very customer-centric distributed business model. That is what I know about utilities, the utility of the future today. I'm happy to take any questions. Here is our contact information for the team, as well as my contact information. We have a quarterly newsletter that we send out, and we are always soliciting and receiving feedback virtually every day. And so please ask questions, be in touch, come volunteer. We have a lot of working groups, and there will be more going forward. But yeah, that's what I have to say right now. I'm happy to take any questions.